Welcome to another Theology Thursday. Today we're going to get to talk about some Greek words and some Hebrew words. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was originally written in Greek. And in both the Old and New Testaments, in both the Hebrew and the Greek languages, we have some terms that kind of describe the way God rules His world, the way God runs the world. And so I just want to kind of cover those words, and it tells us a lot about the nature of God, but also tells us a lot about some of the expectations of the way that we are supposed to behave as people who inhabit the world that God has created. So I said, let's look at some of these words. The first word that I would like for us to look at is the word Zedek. That's the Hebrew word. The Greek word is dikaosune. You may have heard the word Zedek before in names like Melchizedek, and this word means righteous or righteousness. And of course, both the Old and New Testaments talk a great deal about righteousness. The primary idea behind Zedek is that it is straight. And this is in contrast to the word for iniquity, which means to be bent or crooked. And here are a couple of descriptions of righteousness that people have given. Someone said it's the standard that God maintains in the world. And it's the norm by which all men will be judged. So when we put those two ideas together, here's what we discover. God has a straight expectation, a straight means by which He operates in the world. That's His standard. It's straight. You and I live righteously when our lives conform to this straight standard that God has had. So righteousness describes God Himself. He is perfectly straight. And you and I live righteously when our lives conform to that standard. Now, the best news about righteousness is that none of us are fully righteous, obviously. None of us fully conform to God's standard. But the cool thing is that when we put our faith in Jesus Christ, God's righteousness, His straightness, is credited to our account, so that it's not our righteousness that gets us into heaven. It's the righteousness of Jesus that's credited to our account. And so essentially, when you and I grow as Christians, our lives are coming more into line with the standard that God has already declared we have because of Jesus. So that's why the Bible says that we are conformed to the image of His Son, Jesus Christ. So God's standard for the world, the norm by which He judges the world and judges people, is this straight, righteous standard. We have another term for God's ruling of our world, and that is Mishpot. The New Testament word is krima. It's where we get all of our criminal words. And this is the word for justice. Now, unfortunately, the idea of judgment has kind of morphed over the centuries. When the King James was translated, they always translated these words with judgment. However, we have reached a point in the English language where judgment is almost always negative. You're judgmental. You pass judgment on somebody. What's the judgment of the court kind of thing? But really, the idea of this word is better captured in modern use with the word justice. It's a positive statement. So God's judgment of the world is not a negative action, but it's His justice. And so the opposite of justice obviously is injustice. And in the Bible, justice is usually portrayed as taking care of the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners in the land. In other words, the people that were the most vulnerable, the people that were the easiest to take advantage of. These were the people that, if we're going to follow God's righteous norm for the world, we do justice by making sure that we stand up for and on behalf of and take care of people in society that are vulnerable. And so as Christians, through the centuries, we have been involved in many ministries that reach out to those who are vulnerable, those that can be taken advantage of. And we seek God's justice in the world. This is why Christians historically have run orphanages. This is why we have taken care of widows. This is why we have helped those who are struggling to survive in this life, so to speak, but also why Christians have opposed things like slavery, why we have opposed like multiple wives and things, because we want to make sure that justice is done in our world. There's another term for God's rule of our world, and that's the word ahav. You may be more familiar with the Greek word agape, and this is the word for love. In the Bible, love can just mean I love apple pie. But most of the time, it carries the idea of commitment, of a faithful kind of love. And so God operates in our world through love, a commitment to His people, a love for His people. And so it's good to know that God does not operate our world out of anger and hatred, but God operates in the world out of love. We have another term, and that is chesed, or charis. And this is the word for grace. And it's good to know that God operates our world, rules our world out of grace. Grace is the idea of giving us what we don't deserve. We don't deserve heaven. We don't deserve forgiveness. We don't deserve this righteousness put on our account. We don't deserve any of this. But God gives it to us in spite of us not deserving it. This maybe is the greatest concept in all the Bible, second only to the concept of God Himself, is this idea of grace, that we are saved by grace, that God operates in His world by grace, and that we can experience His grace. And so it's great to know that God works in our world in justice, but He also works in our world in grace, and we have a gracious God, and that He works in the world that way. And then the last term, maybe the most significant, is kadosh, or hagios is the Greek word. And this is the word usually translated holy. Now, holy is a concept that, again, has become kind of negative. We think of holier than thou kind of thing. We think of it as sort of an arrogant type of deal. But the reality is that the idea behind holiness is to be separated. And so we're not like everything else. And it's really interesting. This word is used in a very unique way in a handful of passages in the Old Testament. I want to give them to you and then talk a little bit about them. So here are these passages, about half a dozen of them, 5 of them. And if you like to look them up and all, you can pause this video and look them up. But in all of these passages, we find not the word translated holy, but the English Standard Version translates them as cult prostitute or male cult prostitute. The King James translated them as sodomites, and here was the reason. It's talking about people that served Baal, and the priests of Baal were called the holy ones. And they were set apart. They were not a part of the regular society. They were set apart in dedication to service to Baal. And that dedication was a part of a fertility religion. Baal religion was a fertility religion. And so they were temple prostitutes because that was a sign of fertility, so that the land would be fertile. And so they were set apart from the norms of society. So when the Bible calls you and me to be holy, it calls us to be separate from the world standards. So remember, righteousness is God's standard in the world. So you and I live by a different standard than the world lives by, than non-believers live by. We live by God's standard, and He's called us to live separate from the way non-believers live. Not in an arrogant, I'm better than you kind of idea, but by a different set of standards, a different set of morals, a different set of ethics. You and I are to reflect the righteousness and the justice and the love and the grace of God. So when we say that God is holy, God's not like us. He's separate from us. He's different from us. And He has called us to live by His holy standards, His standards that are different than the standards that unbelievers have. And so God rules the world in holiness, expressed in His righteous, just, loving, gracious standards for this world. So when we think about God at work in this world, He doesn't just sort of work randomly or just situation by situation, but these are overarching characteristics of God by which He rules and reigns and operates our world. So I hope this helps you a little bit, just understanding the way, the fundamental background, the foundation of the way in which God works in our world. So God bless you, and I hope you have a great day and a great week.